All right, so in the previous section, we're able to create our atlas map and start rotating it and creating coordinates. And now we can get back to start drawing our, completing our chart by creating widget that will interact with the map we created. As you can see here, we have that our interactive resume include companies. And once you click on a company, it will update the data and give a URL. And once you hover over the map pause, and you can also click the those markers and it will give the same information. Once you mouse out from the map, it continues to rotate, and you can also change the markers and the information by clicking those arrows. So as you can see here, when I'm changing that list, it's an infinite loop of arrow left and right, and it changes our data. So we can really interact it from all the elements, either from the map or from the list or from the detail section. So we're going to be building that. Let's get started. From my experience, the best place to start when you're working with chart is really from the data. So if we look at the previous data that we had two files. We had the coordinates that we just had an ID, latitude, longitude, and then we have the world 110 map. That was the map data and the country's data. So we're going to be reusing that, the world map for our map. And for coordinates, instead of coordinate, I created a new CSV and I called it client list. And what I've done is I just added more field on the client list. For example, ID, name, logo, description, address, city, state, country, latitude, longitude, and website. This way we can use that data in the detail when we show information about the companies for our interactive resume. So I had to go and get all the latitude and longitude. I had to pull all that information, and I also created a client logo folder inside of public that includes all the company that I did work for, and then I point out the name of the client logo inside that CSV. So you can create your own resume and put all the companies or whatever you want to use this for, and get that ready. And once we have the CSVs ready, you can delete the old one, the coordinates. We're not going to use that anymore. Once you have that ready, the next place to go and to continue is really creating the model. And we're going to be using Recoil as we did before in order to share the data across different components. So if you look inside of the model folder, I have two files and I have an index. The client object, I just copied all those different properties of the CSV. So I just created an interface called client object, and I parsed all the different fields and gave them the type. And then I created another object to initialize the client object. So once we call that, it's just gonna give us an empty object. This way we can use it before we load our data. I gave it an ID of -1 just so we know that it's just a dummy data. And for the map data, what I've done is I just took over. If you remember, we had the map object as a state using React state. So I just moved it as an interface of map object, and then I also created initialize map object that will include the map feature. So I just moved it down here into a model, and then I also added a method to set it up. So if I call the set map object and I pass my map object, it's just going to set it as map feature. So this way we have our model ready, and then in my index I just reference those objects, so it's going to be easy to access them. So if you look at the project final result, you have those files ready, and our next step is really to start working on our Recoil files. In terms of Recoil, Recoil is really built out of atoms and selectors. And Recoil really took all that boilerplate code that it's so annoying in other data management libraries out there, like Redux. And what it did is it allows us to really even use just one of them. We can just use an atom, or we can just use a selector. Since I decided to create a model file, we actually don't even need to create atoms. We can create a selector that will retrieve our data, and we can use the model object that I created, and then we really don't even need an atom. So all that we need to do, we need to create selectors that will go and pull the data from the CSV and from the JSON, and just populate the data for us so we can use it across all of our components and elements. So to do that, let's close everything up so it's all clean up. So let's go into our Recoil folder. Let's collapse everything so we can see what's happening. Open up source, and you'll see the Recoil folder. And since we don't need an atoms and only selectors, we'll create two files. One of them we'll call client selectors.ts, and the next one will be the map selectors. We'll do it when we finish. So by the way, if you look inside the README, I'm showing you an example how to create a selector, so it can save you some time. So you can copy that and just make your changes, but we can just write it from scratch. So what we need to do is we need to give it a name. So a good name would be get previous client list data, because this list is my previous clients. And I'm going to use selector from Recoil, and inside my selector we can set our object, and our object is going to made out of two things. It's going to made out of a key, and it's going to made out of a get method. Okay, for our key, we're just going to use the same function name, just capital, because that's the standard with Recoil. And for the data, we're going to use asynchronous call, and we can map that to a method that we can. I like to break it out, but you can put your code in line here. I'm just going to break it out, and I call it get data. So in our get data function, we're not passing any variable. By the way, when you work with Recoil, you can also pass a variable or get a state, but we don't need this for what we're doing here. And we're going to return a promise, and in our promise, it's going to be, we're going to pass the resolve that will set whatever we want to return back. And then I'm going to use d3 to load that CSV file. Let's use the DSV. We used that before with the delimiter and with the data we're using. So the data we're using is /data/client list CSV, and we're going to return our results. So let's pass the data and return the data. And then once this is done, by the way, we need to import D3. For some reason, the ID never let me bring D3, so I need to do it manually. So import star is D3 from D3. Okay, and now once the results are back, we can use the then API and just take the data, and now we need to cast it for a resolve. So the resolve is how we're returning it. And we need to cast it. So it needs to get casted as the model we created, which was client object. Okay, and that's because this object it's an array with multiple object of client object. We need to put the object type, and we need to convert it first to unknown, and that's it. We got our client selector. For map selector, I'm going to create a new file. Let's call it map selectors. And again, I mentioned this before, I'm using plural, even though we have one selector, because it's just a good practice in case you want to bundle up a few of those selectors together. So we will create a new selector. Let's call it get map data. And that's going to be of type selector from Recoil. And inside, we'll put the key. And we'll use the same function name, get map data, and we'll use asynchronous, and we're gonna map it to our custom function. Let's call it get map data from file, because we already have the file. And in our get map data from file, this time instead of using d3, so it's a little bit more interesting, I'm going to use the fetch that it's built in React as part of the ES5. So I can use resolve. So it's very similar. The code is a little bit different, you'll see. And inside my resolve, I can, I did new promise and resolve. Okay, let's collapse this. Oops. Okay, now we need to fetch the file we're using. The file we're using is in data slash, let's see, public data, okay, world 110m.json, and once we get that, then we have the response, and we can check the response. If the response is of status 200, then we know it's okay. But if it's different than 200, then we know we have a problem, right? So we can just type in console log and put a message, Houston, we have a problem. And then we can pass in the response with the status message, so we can handle that. Okay, let's see what else. Then we can just get out of this function. We'll put a return in case there's an error, and if there's no error, then we can take the response and we can take the JSON, so it will format it as JSON, and then we can handle our data. So let's call it world data, and in our world data we can create, we can resolve our map object. And what we can do is we can take that crazy statement. We wrote it a couple times before. I'm not going to write it again. I have it ready for us. So the map features, if you remember, we're using an array of type features. We're using the geometry, and we're creating our feature. So this is what we've done before. I don't want to write the whole thing again. It's not necessary. The bottom line, it gives us the features of the object we need. and then we can take that map feature, and then we can use our set map feature that we set in our object and pass the map feature. So if you look again in the map object we created the map object that once you set it, it turns it into the map object and set it for us. So it's going to be formatted as an object with a map feature, and that's going to really match the format we have it in the last section. Some errors here. It's look like I have an extra equal sign that will break everything out, and we need to suppress the no console since our ESLint is built that way. Okay, great. So now we have both of them. We have the client selector and the map selector. Okay, let's collapse everything, close everything, all the folders, everything, and now we can create our widget. For the widget, we have already ready code if we want to use that, or we can just create it from scratch. Up to you. We can just create our directory and we can call it clients widget, and inside we can create our function component clients widget.tsx, and inside we'll create our function component and we'll call Recoil to get the data. So clients widget, and it's going to be a function component, and then we need to export default, because function component needs at least one function to return as the default, and then we can return inside our function, we need to return the JSX. We can just return an empty tag at this point, and it's gonna fail for us because we need to import React. If we don't import React, the function doesn't know what it means, those closing and opening tag. So we need to import React so it knows to recognize that from React. Okay, here we go. And now we can create our constant just like we use state, but this time we're going to map it to Recoil. So we're going to do the client data, and we're going to create a constant for the map data. For the client data, the type is going to be the model we created, which was client object, and it was an array. And for the map data, the type was the map object, and both of them we're going to use recoil value. Okay, and for the client object, what we can do is we can use the method in the selector we created. So if you look back in our selector, go to recoil selector. If we look at the client selector, we call it get previous list data. So we can use that and import that. And for the map selector, we use get map data. We need to make sure that our recoil objects are cast correctly. So we need to cast it as client object and cast the map data as map data. And now if we want to see the actual results, what we can do is we can use effect, and instead of our use effect hook, once recoil is finished, it's gonna go and give us the results. It's complaining about because it needs to be map object. Okay, and now we can put a console log to see the results. So if we want to see our results, and we can just put a console log for both of them, and what we can do is we can just type in the results using template style, and we can use JSON stringify and then just pass in the client data, and we can do the same for the map data. If we want to stop at our, let's collapse everything. If we want to stop at the right here at this line, I'm just going to put another console so we can stop at this line breakpoint complete. I want to stop here with my breaking point. Look like I got a typo. It needs to be lowercase React. Okay. And now if I'm going to run the in debug mode, we'll be able to see what's going on. But we need to make sure we add our widget to our app.tsx. So open app.tsx, and inside of the header, let's add our widget, client widget. There you go. Okay, now we're ready to run in debug mode. So once you run it in debug mode, it's gonna break after recoil, retrieve the data. So that all that scaffolding and all that stuff happened for us automatically. I'm not running. You have to run yarn start to make sure we're running on port 3000 for Chrome to work. Let's close Chrome. Let's do it over again. And let's debug again. We have to wait until the server is running, so let's just wait 1 second. Let's look in terminal. It's starting the server. It takes a few seconds. Okay, here we go. So you can see it's stopping here in our use effect hook. And now if we look at the data, we have the client data. Here's all the data from the client. And for the map data, here's the map features with the array. So our data is ready to be used. We're really ready to move on and start building our widget.